Good morning, friends. It is March the 6th. My name is Greg Simpson, and this is our daily Lenten Devotional. Can you believe that we are this far through Lent already? Our lectionary readings are starting to point us towards the end of Lent, draw us into the Passion narrative, draw us into that final week of Jesus' life. Of course, that leads to his death on Good Friday and resurrection on Easter Sunday. So today we're going to be reading the story of Jesus in the temple, and that comes Mark 11. We're going to read verses 15 to 18. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." When the chief priests and the scribes heard about it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. This is one of the very few times that we see Jesus expressing this sort of unbridled anger. That's kind of the way that I picture it. Now, maybe as you read that or listened to it, it sounded different to you. And we are probably morphing together the stories from different gospels. Several of them talk about this particular story, but they frame it in different ways. I think in one of the other ones, he makes a short whip and he drives people out using it. There are all these extra layers of the passion that Christ holds in this moment. I really think that there's a lot of value in taking a look at this, but we need to not just stay at the surface. We need to dive right in and dig into the guts of this story, because as Christian people, reading about a Jewish man responding to what he saw as being struggles within the Jewish faith of their time, it would be super easy for us to slide into some accidental antisemitism. So I'm going to avoid that entirely. First off, by reminding us this is Jesus, a Jew, calling out the difficulties that he saw within the institution of the Jewish temple. So if we're going to take this story and do anything with it, then I hope one of the things we would do is look at the religions that we hold near and dear, the ones that we are part of, the ones that we know the interworkings very well. And I hope that we use this as an opportunity to look for the problems, look for the struggles. And because we are on the inside, then we can call them out as well, much like Jesus was doing here. But I want to get even deeper into the context here, because it gives us even more understanding of why he was so frustrated and sort of what he was responding to. Because he wasn't angry at all of Judaism. He wasn't angry at everything going on in the temple. In fact, as we read through the Gospels, we see that he supports and builds up and speaks a lot about various different parts of the ancient Jewish faith. So he's not tearing it all down, but he has found some particular things that he is quite frustrated with, and that's what he's pointing out. And I want us to kind of keep our eyes open and keep our minds open as we hear this, because for me personally, I see a lot of parallels in some of our religions today. So, some of what he was responding to was that the religious organization had become oppressive in particular ways. This religion that by its own definition was built on caring for people who were in need. That comes up all the way through the Old Testament, this discussion of caring for the widows, the orphans, and the aliens in your country. taking care of the people who are maybe struggling to take care of themselves. But in this time, and specifically what he was addressing here, were some of these laws around sacrifices. Specifically, he's talking about the money changers. And this gets quite complicated as we dig into the history, because this is in Jerusalem, which is part of the state of Judah. Maybe state isn't the right word, kingdom of Judah, but it is still entirely owned by, annexed by the Romans. And so the Jews had their own money, and then the Romans had their own money. And if you were part of the culture, you might actually get paid in Roman money, but then if you went to the temple and you had to give alms, or you needed to purchase something there, you would have to exchange your money. And see, what happens is the temple got drawn more and more into the politics of the day. The temple was quite different from what we see our churches as being. It wasn't just a spot that people showed up for an hour on Sundays. Now, maybe you're part of a church that's much more active than that. And I know the church that I serve has lots of people coming and going throughout the week as well. But the temple itself, and in fact, the faith, was integral to their life. They wouldn't even use a phrase like religion, like this is what I believe in. That concept, they didn't even have a matrix to explain that concept. They were Jewish. It was baked into who they were. The order, the pacing of all of the celebrations and the worship, this was how they lived their lives. It was very much who they were, not just something they chose to believe in. And so when that organization starts to align itself with the political situations and the economic situations, and we do see both in the Bible and in some of the historical records that fit from the same time period, is certainly the temple, the people that were the organization and the leaders in the temple held a lot of sway within the culture. And so as they aligned with the Romans, it was very beneficial for the Romans to align with the temple to keep down sort of insurrections. I mean, the Romans weren't that fussed. If you made too much of a mess, they would just come and wipe you out. But for the leaders of the temple, it made sense for them to use the temple as a place to shape and change the culture so that they could remain under Roman rule without getting wiped out, but then also try and hold some of their own identity as well. It was a careful and a dangerous balance. And unfortunately, in the midst of that, some of the people who fell by the wayside were the people who were in the most need. And throughout Jesus' ministry, we see him showing up in places where people were really struggling. He ate with the tax collectors and the sinners and the sex workers. He was involved and engaged and showing up for the people who needed the most care. What he's pointing out here is the exact opposite. Because if we spend a little bit of time in Leviticus, and I don't know if you've been through it before, there's a lot of laws, a lot of rules, but it helps us to understand why he references specifically the seats of those who sold doves. There are some particular sacrifices that they would expect you to have a sacrifice of a lamb or a young goat. And if you weren't rich enough to have that, then you could have a sacrifice. You could share a goat with another family. And if you weren't even rich enough for that, then you could have a sacrifice of a dove. And in this case, they've got people selling doves. So there's actually like an economic structure that had built up to extract resources, extract money from the people who were already recognized as being near the margins of the society. They were not wealthy enough to meet some of the rules and the structure of the religion. And then within the temple, those same people were being oppressed. They were being exploited. And so that's what Jesus is responding to. So I wonder if you know of any religious organizations, and I don't mean others, ones that you're part of. Rather than us calling out the Jews for their problems, let's look in the mirror and call out the religious organizations that we're part of that sometimes feel like they're a little too political, Like they're a little bit too focused on making sure that they'll still be around after the next election cycle, or they'll still have power. Now, I'm in Canada, but the American politics definitely impact us deeply, and we see a lot of the news. And the reality is that we have some political parties and religious organizations here in Canada that relate fairly closely as well. I'm not sure about other parts of the world, whether there are also situations where political parties and religions find themselves getting into bed together because they can wield more power that way. Jesus is calling them out. And what about the religious organizations that find themselves in a space where they can either accidentally or sometimes intentionally exploit the people who are already at the margins of society? Now, that might show up as people who are the least wealthy or the people who are in the most need. But it might also show up as people who have been excluded from societies in particular ways, or maybe even by religions. Specifically, I'm talking about like in the immigrant populations or indigenous populations. That's definitely an issue we have here in Canada. Perhaps it's racial differences where religion will use a difference in race as a way of marking their identity. These people are ours and those people are not. Another great example would be the conversation around to us LGBTQIA plus people. Are we using that marginalized group as a tool in our political or religious discussions and our plays for power and religious identity? I think the reality is we don't have to look far at all to find places where Jesus would show up and start knocking over tables and start calling us out for making the religion be the thing we're focused on rather than the core tenets of that religion, that being loving our neighbor and caring for the people who most desperately need care. Now, I realize you might be feeling a little bit called out, because I am too. The United Church of Canada that I serve struggles in those ways also, some bigger than others. But it turns out that wherever humans are, we will have these messy edges. And so it's a great reminder for us to read this story, to put ourselves in this place and remind ourselves that Jesus is speaking to us when he says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations." Maybe we can return our religious organizations to being houses of prayer for all the nations. Let us pray. Jesus, from across the ages and through the sands of time, you reach out to us. You hold up a mirror to ourselves and our religious organizations so that we can see the places where we have fallen down, where we've become too focused on the power and the privilege, the religious structure, or even the commerce and the capitalism and the making of money so that we can be around. We are called to notice where we exploit, whether accidentally or intentionally. We're called to turn away from the places where we are just taking money from one and turning it into another so that we can benefit. Let us not be the ones who are selling doves to the weakest and the poorest in our society. Rather, let's show up at their doorstep saying, if you would like to be a part of our rituals, our traditions, our religion, then here's your dove. Here's how to do it. Jesus, we're going to need some of your passion and your righteous indignation, because as we push back against the organizations we belong to, it's going to be tough. People are going to resist, and it's going to be hard on us as well. Yet, on this Lenten journey, as we see your sacrificial love, as you walked towards that cross, we too pick up our cross, knowing that we need to follow your example. Give us the strength and the courage to rout out the money changers in our own lives and in our own souls, and then use that to change the direction and the cultures of the religious organizations we belong to, that we may all draw closer to you and your model and your teaching. Amen. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. And if I have offended you, I'm not going to say I'm sorry, because Jesus' intent was to offend, but I want to invite you to take a moment and wonder about the ways that the organizations you're part of could change. The reality is we are all humans, and these religions are organizations built by humans and run by humans, and we're always going to have messy and complicated edges. So please don't be offended to the point where you leave in a huff. But if this helps you see that there are changes necessary, I invite you to take what steps there are to make sure that that culture shifts. That if Jesus were to show up in your religious organization, he would see that you were caring for the people who need care, that you were tending to the widows and the orphans and the aliens in your country, that you were sitting down to meals with the tax collectors and the sinners and the sex workers. That's all any of us can do. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. If you've missed any previous videos, I invite you to click over there. You can click up there and subscribe. Maybe click on the thumbs up while you're down there. I love you all so very much. I will see you tomorrow. Bye for now.